The other day, I was just a little down. It was one of those pandemic downs where I was just overwhelmed. I was just tired and just wasn't feeling like I was winning that day. And so I thought, okay, what do I do to get out of the funk? So I thought I'm gonna go for a run because get some, endorphins flowing. I always feel better when I'm out running with Bailey. And I was running, and I don't listen to music anymore. I usually just take the time to pray or to think or just clear my head. And so it was a great day to run. And I was still just, kicking around in my head, where God is in all of this, and is what I'm doing, does it matter at all in the grand scheme of things with all the problems that are going on? And as I was finishing my run, coming up towards where I live, I looked up ahead, and a gray minivan, SUV-ish kind of thing had pulled over to the side of the road. And I'm like, I wonder why they're there. And as I'm running closer, just still lost in my thoughts, I look up again and I look in the windshield, and there are two people smiling at me, and it's Ardell and Sandy Johnston. And so I stopped, and I sweat, and we talked, and it was just so great to catch up with them. We stood and talked for probably 10 minutes. And as I started to walk away from them and they drove off, I went back to thinking, well, God, where are you in my life today? And I'm like, you're an idiot. God just showed up in a major way, and you almost missed it. Ardell and Sandy were an answer to prayer that day. And then I got to thinking about different ways that God has been present in my life. And I thought about people who recently had brought lunch over for the staff, or brought cookies and coffee, and any of you want to do that? Food is the way to our hearts. And different people who had called or had sent a note or something like that. And I'm like, there are so many ways in my life where God shows up with little bits of encouragement, little bits of hope. And as I realized, actually what I was realizing was how close I had come to missing it. It made me realize that what I needed to do was stop and make sure that I was looking for God, because I don't want to miss what He's doing. And that really is at the center of this interesting and kind of strange story that I want to tell today. It's familiar, and so at some level we've kind of lost how strange it actually is. But it's all about looking for where God is at work and sometimes missing it. So today we're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew, reading from chapter 2, verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So, who were the Magi? Or in your translation, or sometimes they're known as wise men, and sometimes in Christmas carols and in other places they're known as the three kings. But it's all the same names for the same people. So Magi is sort of the technical term for who they are. Who are they? Well, they were astronomers. They were people who knew the stars. They had charts of them. And they were also astrologers in the sense that they thought that the movement of the stars and the positions of the stars predicted the future or meant something. So there was meaning in the stars. Because of that, they were highly educated people. They also, people believe, were a part of a priestly caste. How they develop is a little bit murky, but apparently, eventually, they kind of merge with Zoroastrianism, which is an ancient religion out of Persia, modern-day Iran. And so they develop in Persia with a little bit of Egyptian influence too. And our word for magic and magician comes from the Magi, because they were also known as magicians, not in the sense of black arts, but just in the sense of specializing in interesting sorts of things. So that's kind of who Magi were: astronomers, astrologers, highly educated, priestly. But why are they in this story? And that's where it gets really interesting. Because in the 600-ish BC is when the Babylonian captivity happens. Babylon comes in and conquers what's left of the people of God and takes the cream of the crop to Babylon. That's why they call it the Babylonian captivity. And so all the big thinkers, all the religious leaders, all the political people are in Babylon. And so people think that while all the Jewish thinkers were in Babylon, that educated people get together, and at this time the Magi heard the Old Testament stories. They learned the Torah from the Jews. They heard the stories of the people of God. And they also heard the rabbis' interpretations of those stories. And there is a verse in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, with the rabbis at that time were already interpreting messianically. And the verse says, "A star shall come forth out of Jacob." So there is this belief that way back centuries earlier, when the Jewish rabbis were sharing stories, that there was this prophecy about a star that was going to come in Judah. And then the story actually gets even more interesting, because one of the more famous people in the entire Old Testament may have actually been a Magi. And this story comes out of Daniel chapter 5. And if you're familiar with the story of Daniel, or even if you aren't, you've heard the English phrase, "He sees the handwriting on the wall." Well, that comes from Daniel chapter 5, where the king of Babylon is having a party, and a hand comes out of nowhere and starts writing on the wall, the handwriting on the wall. And it's in a foreign language, it's in Hebrew, which they don't speak, so they don't know how to interpret it. And then, picking up the story in Daniel chapter 5, verse 10, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar," and here's the line, "appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." And so there's a significant group of people that actually think that Daniel stands in the tradition of the Magi, which would tell us that there's a whole body of Jewish knowledge and insight among the Magi who were living in the East. Well, however it comes about, there was a group of people that were looking for a sign from God. And isn't that an interesting posture? To spend your life looking for where God might be at work, instead of just me being in the zone running, looking for where God might be acting in your life and in your world. So they're looking for this sign, and they get it. So maybe for a couple of hundred years, They have this expectation that there's going to be a star, there's going to be a sign, and all of a sudden, this is it. Now, nobody knows what it was. And it's particularly interesting this year because we've got the conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, which people are calling a Bethlehem star. But it might have been a comet. It might have been a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. It might have been a miracle of God. I have absolutely no idea about that. But whatever it was a sign to the Magi. But it was also a sign to the people because they had been looking too. And Matthew knows Isaiah 60, and you might too, only you've never heard it like this in this context. Listen, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. There's the line. There will be a light. There will be a star. There will be a brightness, and kings will be drawn to it. So this is where the tradition of them being kings comes from. And a few verses down, they will bring gifts of gold and frankincense. So this expectation is deep in the people's consciousness that this thing is going to happen. A star is going to rise, there's going to be a light, and people from the east will be drawn to it bringing gifts. And Matthew knows all of this, and the people are looking for a sign. I think that's partly why it's included, because Matthew is signaling to them, this is what you're waiting for. In fact, this idea of a star coming is so deeply embedded in people that even though they missed it in Jesus, 100 years later, it crops up again during the Bar Kokhba revolution in 132 AD. It was an insurrection against Rome, and it was led by a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba, except that his original name was Bar Kokhba, which means son of a ram. But when he was going to hopefully lead the people to overthrow Rome, he changed his name from Bar Kokhba, son of a ram, to Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star. And then when the revolution went nowhere, the rabbis changed his name to Bar Kokhba, which means son of lies. So the Magi show up several times in the Bible, and they aren't always looked upon favorably because of the magic and the astrology overtones. But here in Matthew chapter 2, they are looked upon favorably. And it's because they understood the significance of what had happened and they responded appropriately. They were looking for God to be at work. And when they saw the sign that God was at work, they came and they worshiped. There's another major character in the story, and that is Herod. So what do you need to know about Herod? Herod was called King of the Jews, but he was in actuality a puppet king of Rome. He was well connected. He was good friends with Caesar Augustus. He was half Jewish, and the people didn't like him. He left an amazing heritage as far as buildings that he built. Many of them, or at least foundations or parts of them, you can still see if and when you travel to the Holy Land. And he did it all in order to curry favor with his people, and particularly with Caesar and Rome. Beyond that, he was paranoid. And Herod would do anything to cling to his power. He didn't care who got destroyed or what damage was done to people or to the nation, what institutions were destroyed. As long as he remained king, no price was too high to pay. He demanded loyalty from everyone, but he showed loyalty to no one in return. In fact, when Herod feared that his wife, Mariamne, who was his favorite wife, whom by all accounts he adored, when Herod feared that his wife Mariamne was trying to poison him, he had her killed. He also thought that two of his sons were plotting against him, so he had them killed too. Caesar Augustus once joked that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. It's a pun in Greek, doesn't come over in English, and has to do with the fact that Jews don't eat pork, so the pig was safe, but apparently Herod's kids weren't. Herod was so terrible and was hated by so many people that he knew that when he died, no one would mourn his passing. So even in death, he was vindictive and nasty. The historian Josephus records that when Herod suspected that he was dying, he ordered that the most, in Josephus's words, illustrious men of the whole Jewish nation should be taken out of every village and imprisoned in the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome was a huge stadium that they used for chariot races. So they brought the leading men of every town in the country, and they basically locked them in an arena. And Herod gave orders that at the moment of his death, that they were all to be slain. That way he would know that people were crying on the day of his death, even if the tears weren't for him. So the wise men come to Herod, and they have a very interesting meeting with him. It says in verse 2, and they asked, "Where is the one who has been born king of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and now you know why. Because Herod wasn't going to put up with anybody who threatened his power. And all Jerusalem with him. Why would Jerusalem be disturbed? Because this was an unpredictable tyrant, and they had absolutely no idea what he would do, but they knew it wouldn't be good. So they talk about this a little bit. Then Herod calls the Magi secretly in verse 7 and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." But there's something about meeting Herod that doesn't sit right with the Magi, and it's confirmed later with the dream. And so when they find Jesus and they worship him, they don't go back to Herod. They leave by another road. And when Herod finds out that they've betrayed him and not been loyal to him, he lashes out angrily. A couple verses later, Matthew 2, verse 16, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Now, I understand the importance of political stability, but this is a person who doesn't think he can or should be replaced, and is reduced by his own insecurities to flailing around and creating pain and misery, all in attempts to hold on to his power. So there's two very, very different responses to Jesus. The Magi are looking to see where God is at work. And when they see where God is at work, they reorient their lives. They put things aside and they set out to find him. And God leads them there. And I think there's a lesson there. It might not be a star, it might be an SUV. But if you're open, God will lead you to the place where you can find him at work. If you're open, you'll be able to see God present in your life and working. To the wise men, the coming of the king is the fulfillment of a promise. And their response is, we need to find him and worship him. In fact, it was the Magi who were the first people in the New Testament who worshiped Jesus. On the other hand, the coming of the king to Herod is a threat, because in Herod's mind, there can only be one king, and it's me. The Magi set an example for the rest of time of offering our gifts and ourselves to Jesus. Herod, he was right. No one mourned his passing. And at the moment he died, the soldiers simply opened the gates and let the people go home. And the entire country breathed a sigh of relief that the tyrant was dead. The wise men were examples. Herod was just pathetic, and no one was inspired by him. Now, none of us rule kingdoms, but it's still possible to have Herod's attitude. I am king. And it's possible to view Jesus as a threat, maybe to our independence, or to our plans, or our preferences, or our prerogatives, or our money. I mean, it's easy to have a belief that we know best. Especially this year, I've noticed there are tons of people who know everything about everything. It's rather intimidating to me. And there's an illusion that we're in control, or at least used to be before 2020. But all of that, the fear of control being taken away, the fear of what God might want to do with our money or with our prerogatives or with our time, all of that betrays a notion that God is going to want us to do stuff that we don't want to do. But the entire Christmas message is about good news. It's about great joy. It's about peace. And I just have this sense that that's what the Magi went back to their country with, and what Herod never found. So I have 3 questions I want to ask you. The first is, where do you suspect God is working in your life? Second, what might keep you from seeing God at work this Christmas? And third, do you view Jesus more as a promise from God or a threat to your independence?